Hi, welcome to a lecture on post-colonial theory and the Secret River. So, literary theory often examines text and we apply a lens through which we look at that text through. So, key points of literary theory: authorial intent is not important. The value of the text is the impact they have on the reader. We use language to try and communicate our experience of our world to others, and all texts are products of their context and reflect particular ideologies and value systems. Traditional literary criticism tracks influences, establishing the canon of major writers in literary periods and clarifying this. A key feature of traditional literary criticism was the consensus within the academy as to what made up the literary canon. That is, the books that all educated person should read, and with the aims of purposes of literature, historical context, and allusions within the text. Post-colonialism and critics are concerned with the fact that literature is often produced by colonial powers and works produced by those who were or are colonized. So they look at what decides on what's in the canon and see how the other is not included. Post-colonial theory looks at issues of power, economics, politics, religion, and culture, and how these elements work in relation to colonial hegemony, which is Western colonizers controlling the colonized. Postcolonial criticism also questions the role of Western literary canon and Western history as dominant forms of knowledge making. The terms First World, Second World, and Third World and Fourth World nations are critiqued by postcolonial critics because they reinforce the dominant positions of Western cultures populating First World status. The critique includes the literary canon and histories written from the perspective of First World cultures. A postcolonial critic might question the works included in the canon because the canon does not contain works by authors outside Western culture. History is written by the victors. Postcolonial criticism is similar to cultural studies, but it assumes a unique perspective on literature and politics that warrants a separate discussion. Specifically, postcolonial critics are concerned with literature produced by colonial powers and produced by those who were or are colonized. Therefore, they might be interested in Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, where the colonial ideology is manifest in Crusoe's colonist attitudes towards the land on which he is shipwrecked, and towards the black man he colonizes and names Friday. In addition, postcolonial theory might point out that despite Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which has an anti-colonist agenda, the novel points to the colonized population as the standard of savagery to which Europeans are contrasted. Moreover, authors included in the canon often reinforce colonial hegemonic ideology, such as Joseph Conrad. Western critics might consider Heart of Darkness an effective critique of colonial behaviour, but post-colonial theorists and authors might disagree with this perspective. As Chinua Achebe observes, the novel's condemnation of Europe is based on a definition of Africans as savages. Beneath their veneer of civilization, the Europeans are, the novel tells us, as barbaric as Africans, and indeed Achebe notes, the novel portrays Africans as a prehistoric mass of frenzied, howling, incomprehensible barbarians. Basically, the premise of Heart of Darkness is the longer that the white man is in South Africa and the more he hangs around the African tribal people, the more savage he becomes. And so basically, the actions of the man are contrasted and considered to be savage because they're considered to be more like the black man's. So while a lot of people applauded it and it's included in the literary canon as an anti-colonist book, it actually reinforces those colonial attitudes. A similar text is the short story The Only One Who Forgot by T.A.G. Hungerford, a West Australian author, and it's set in Broome. This story is a beautiful story with lots of amazing imagery, and it's about the innocent meeting of a young Aboriginal Australian boy who meets with a young white girl who's down up from Perth, on holiday with her aunt, and how the woman her aunt who raised him turns against him as soon as she sees him playing with the young white girl because of their preconceived notions. So in that story, T.A.G. Hungerford is very complimentary towards the young boy Brandy. He's described as having lustrous skin, and he is described as free, and the imagery throughout it is very, very beautiful. And there's lots of contrasting imagery between the white town and the black boy. However, his colonist attitude comes through the text when he compares Brandy to a dog, a snake, a goanna, and a fish, so constantly animalizing him in his beautification of the boy. So typical questions that a post-colonial author would ask are, how does the literary text explicitly or allegorically represent various aspects of colonial oppression? What does the text reveal about the problematics of post-colonial identity, including the relationship between personal and cultural identity, and such issues as double consciousness and hybridity? What persons or groups does the work identify as other or stranger, and how are such persons or groups described and treated? What does the text reveal about the politics or psychology of anti-colonist resistance? What does the text reveal about the operations of cultural difference, the ways in which race, religion, class, gender, sexual orientation, cultural belief, and customs combine to form individual identity in shaping our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the world in which we live? How does the text respond to or comment upon the characters, themes, or assumptions of a canonized colonist work? There are meaningful similarities among the literatures of post-colonial populations, are there? And how does the literary text in the Western canon reinforce or undermine colonist ideology through its representation of colonization or its inappropriate silence about colonized people? So the colonisation of Australia had a devastating effect on Indigenous people who have lived on this land for thousands of years. Prior to British settlement, more than 500 Indigenous groups inhabited the Australian continent, 750,000 in total. Their cultures developed over 60,000 years, making them the custodians of the most ancient living culture. Each group lived in close relation with the land and had custody over their own country. Captain Cook claimed possession for England in 1770 during his first Pacific voyage. He claimed possession of the east coast of Australia for the British Crown, and upon his return, his reports inspired them to decide to put a penal colony here. The new colony was intended to alleviate overcrowding in British prisons and help them expand the British Empire. Now, when we look at the Secret River, our protagonist turns antagonist at points throughout the text, the Thornhills, but in actual fact we're incited to feel sympathy for them, and that's why the author spends so long setting up their life in England before he is transported, because she shows that the poor are equally victims to colonial rule. And when they arrive, she spends the time showing how that colonial rule was more of an invasion and less of a settlement. And she showed how the two groups not understanding each other is what led to all the future issues in this country. Disease, dispossession, and direct conflict. In 1788, Arthur Phillip and 1,500 convicts, crew, marines, and civilians arrived at Sydney Cove. In the 10 years that followed, it's estimated that the Indigenous population was reduced by 90%. The three main reasons were introduction of new disease, settler acquisition of Indigenous lands, direct and violent conflict with the colonisers. The most immediate consequence was a wave of epidemic diseases, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, which spread ahead of the frontier and annihilated the communities. Governor Phillip reported that smallpox had killed half the Indigenous people in the Sydney region within 14 months of arrival of the First Fleet. Now think about how the government's responding to the coronavirus at the moment in certain communities as well, in Indigenous communities around Australia. The government has really cracked down on movement into these communities, and those communities are now blocked off. There are police and army blocking the way so that people cannot spread the diseases to these communities. And that's because they separated from us so long ago. The landmass that connected Asia and Australia broke away, and these group of people developed at a different rate to what we did. We adapted over time, and thus our genetic material can handle some of these diseases better than theirs can. The same as they can't handle our diets, and why there's so much cases of kidney disease and all sorts of obesity, and also many other illnesses. I've had a blank on what it's called, where your glucose levels. Sorry, later on. Anyway, so Aboriginal people, more than anyone, suffer from many diseases that they call white man's disease because their bodies are not made to deal with it. So these things decimated their communities when they arrived. And then there was also sexual abuse and exploitation of Indigenous girls and women, which led to venereal disease being introduced into the populations. The expansion of British settlements, including the establishment of colonies in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, Adelaide, Moreton Bay, Brisbane, and Port Phillip, Sydney, resulted in competition over land and resources and quickly resulted in violence. Levels of frontier violence are hotly debated, but historical records document numerous occasions on which the Indigenous people were hunted and brutally murdered. Massacres of Indigenous people often took the form of mass shootings or driving groups of people off cliffs, and there are numerous accounts of colonists offering Indigenous people food laced with arsenic. In less than 20 years, we've swept them off the face of the earth. We have shot them down like dogs. In the guise of friendship, we've issued corrosive subliminate in their damper and consigned whole tribes to the agonies of an excruciating death. We have made them drunkards and infected them with diseases which have rotted their adults and made their few children, as born amongst them, a sorrow and torture from the very instant of their birth. We have made them outcasts on their own land and are rapidly consigning them to entire annihilation. And that was written by Edward Wilson Argus in 1856. Now, people are often believe that all people of this time regarded the Indigenous people the same way, but it's not true. There were many, many accounts of people who were very sympathetic to their cause and didn't see them as animals. One of my favourite poets is Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, and she also was writing around this time and was married to the one of the first Aboriginal protectors. And two of her most famous and my favourite poems is Aboriginal Mother and Aboriginal Father, and these discuss the Myall Creek massacres, where a whole tribe of Aboriginal people were just wiped out by white people. And this is also a really good text to study when looking at and doing a post-colonial reading, because Dunlop, while sympathetic towards them, often uses terminology that shows that she comes from a colonial sort of background and that she didn't really understand how the Aboriginal people worked. For example, she calls them tribes, which we know that they tend to refer to themselves as family groups, because tribes have a chieftain, and they did not have that. They have councils of elders. And there's other things that she mentions too that but still, she was a sympathetic voice in this time period, and there were quite a few people that were sympathetic to their cause, but it didn't help, unfortunately, the Indigenous people. So it's important to recognise that from the beginning of colonisation, Indigenous people did resist the violation of their right to land, and it had an impact on their cultures and communities. It's estimated at least 20,000 Aboriginal people were killed as a direct result of colonial violence during this era of Australian history. Between 2,000 and 2,500 settlers' deaths resulted from frontier conflict during the same period. And this is an issue many people have currently. We have a lot of museums that ignore the fact, and a lot of people are fighting for the rights for those wars, the frontier wars, to be included in our history and being taught to our kids in primary school and in upper school history, and to actually be featured and be respected, the people on both sides of those wars. But unfortunately, in Australia, we have a habit of brushing over that side of history. So the Secret River, Kate Grenville's Secret River, focuses on the relationship between a family of settlers, the Thornhills, and the Darug people on the Hawkesbury River, and it resonates with debates over Aboriginal self-determination and government intervention in contemporary Australia. The problem of Indigenous inhabitants, whose presence reminds invaders of their inauthenticity of their connection to the land they're attempting to claim their own, is a central tension for the national myths of origin. It is this problem which stands in the way of understanding oneself as possessing and being authentically native to the new nation that Grenville's text examines, and why there's a constant worrying away at the question of difference. The text not only deconstructs national myths, but dismantles otherness and the deconstruction of binaries. The novel revisits and revises mythologized accounts of pioneering triumphs on the frontier and replaces them with conflict, violence, and loss. So a lot of our history that was told as if we were heroes, as if we were conquerors, as if people came here and they battled away a place that was empty and isolate and hard to live in, which many of those things were true, but it wasn't empty. And they are often made heroes out of these people. You look at our Australian history, the one that's taught to primary school students and even in upper school history, and it celebrates people and creates that modern Australian larrikin and the Australian hero who's tough and can survive anything. But this text goes beyond that, and it subverts various tropes about Aboriginal people and goes beyond providing a corrective to the racist myths to reveal what lies at the heart of such stereotypes about the Aboriginal people. It strikes at the heart of the oppositions that structure the way settlers and Indigenous relationships are represented, and disrupts the idea that one group is completely different from and entirely unreachable by the other. So the text blurs the distinction between the savage and civilized. For example, through Will Thornhill's gradual dawning awareness that far from being savages, the Darug have social structures which is beyond his power to grasp. When Will and Sal order Dick not to play with the Darug children, the explanation Sal gives, "They savages, Dicks, we're civilized folks, we don't go round naked." Yet in paragraphs that follow, we see how spurious this apparently civilized nature is when Will flies into a violent rage. The process of undoing another antithesis, the association of Aboriginal people with the physical body and Europeans with the mind, begins right from the prologue, when the first Aboriginal man Will meets is able to imitate English words, while Will has no success at producing Aboriginal words either initially or later. Sal's statement, "Well, you're no better than a dumb animal," which operates in conjunction with another binary, that of animal-human, is directed at the Darug, but is more applicable to the Thornhills themselves. Secret River breaks colonial stereotypes. The Darug prove their shrewdness when they get the better of the Thornhills on several occasions, for example in the transaction over the kangaroo meat, and they are evidently clever in their use of cultivation and hunting techniques. These episodes also speak to another opposition, that Europeans as naturally hard-working, against a backdrop of the settlers grumbling that the Darug are lazy. Will comes to realise that in fact it is he who is not making the most effective use of his time in trying to provide food for his family. For example, when he observes the way the Darug do not spend effort and energy fencing in kangaroos, but rather drive them to a particular place and then kill only as many as they need. When the Thornhills first notice the daisy yam plot, but Will tells his sons that the poxy blacks don't plant nothing, thinking that, like children, they did not plant today so they could eat tomorrow. It was why they were called savages. This is so clearly untrue that it is given to a child Dick to point out that the Darug do in fact cultivate plots, planting those things like you would taters. Later, when Dick points to the superiority of the Darug's farming methods, no damned weeding the corn all day, this is so unwelcome that for the first time in his life Will gives his son a beating. The fury Will feels, it seems, arises not from Dick's unwillingness to work, but from the challenges to his way of thinking about the Darug as something other than civilized and the Aboriginal people as naturally idolent, living and working the land. So a lot of people still believe the myth that the black people did not plant stuff. And the narrative suggested a reason for the construction of this myth, aired repeatedly throughout the narrative, that Aboriginal people did not cultivate crops. It's not because they did not farm, but that the settlers did not recognise what they did as farming. And moreover, when Will does willingly admit to himself that the patch of soil has been farmed and that it's prime territory for the crops he wants to plant, he wants to take the plot for himself and thus uproots what the Darug have planted there. The obvious material benefits, beside the assertion that everyone knew the blacks did not plant things, are made clear. The text not only foregrounds the power of discourse to establish differences in face of clear evidence to the contrary, but puts forward reasons why this might be a powerful lasting claim. If the Indigenous inhabitants of the land did not farm land, then they could not be using it according to white rule, and it was much easier for the settlers then to develop the terra nullius doctrine and assert ownership. So we didn't want to believe the reality, and people still today will still argue that that's a fact because it's been taught throughout history since our kids are in primary school. Aboriginal people did not farm, they did not cultivate the land, therefore they did not do anything with the land, therefore we felt we could come take it. Juxtaposing ideas in a new reality. Another means which the text achieves this is by constant juxtaposing between the settlers and the Darug. The two methods of farming, the two methods of making fire, the two patriarchs at the end of the novel. Sal learns that the Darug women have their own routines of domestic work and childcare that resemble hers, while Dick, the child born between England and Australia, plays with the Darug children, learns a language, and shows it's possible to live in both worlds until he's forbidden by his parents. Those exploration of the innate differences dividing Europeans from indigenous peoples, which have been used to legitimate the control of the latter by the former, may be Grenfell's fictionalisation of the actual agriculture and hunting practices along the Hawkesbury in the early 19th century. Nevertheless, they're effective in decolonising ideas that colonists have used for hundreds of years. On the first occasion where the Hawkesbury settlers gather at Thornhill's Point, Sajidi complains that the Darug have stolen his foals and Will remembers how he and Sal stole a hen back in England. Shortly afterwards, when Smasher rages that Darug ain't nothing but thieves, don't know how to do nothing but thieve off honest men, Blackwood points out that Smasher himself is a thief. While the settlers repeatedly describe the Aborigines as animals or insects, the text keeps reiterating the animal-like characteristics of the settlers. Smasher likens the Aboriginals to flies. It's like bleeding flies, kill one, 10 more come to its funeral, yet is the first to appear like a bug out of the woodwork. When alcohol is on offer, Webb says they're vermin, the same way rats is vermin. Yet he himself is infested by nits and the first to have his crops eaten by corn grubs, as well as having the nickname spider. Beyond the emphasis on vermin, there are also lines drawn between the settlers and animals. Sajidi has a scalp ridged like a bulldog's face, Smasher a scaly face, and Spider a hair rough as a dog's. The accusations and metaphors used by the settlers keep being undermined by the settlers' own behaviour. Spider's claim that the Darug was cut us up like you would a beast and eat the best bits recalls the description of his wife's cooking chicken in a pot a few paragraphs earlier. Subverting ideas. These episodes in the novel serve to subvert established narratives about Europeans as naturally hardworking and Aborigines as naturally idle and unable to cultivate crops. In this way, the novel takes on familiar tropes about Indigenous peoples, which have come to have a particular force within an Australian context and which continue to circulate in popular discourse today, not only around laziness and an inability to farm, but also around alcohol addiction. The text initially fulfills expectations. One of the first Aboriginal men to appear in the narrative is an alcoholic and a figure of fun. When drunk, he can be made to dance for the entertainment of the settlers. However, along with Will, as we spend longer in the world of the text, we encounter greater numbers of Aboriginal people. The picture becomes more complex. The obvious dependence of the settlers on alcohol implicitly undermines the association of Indigenous people with alcohol abuse. Deconstructing colonial myths. In its undermining of dichotomies that underlie the settlers' discourse and its demonstration that the settlers inhibit the same characteristics which they deride the Aboriginal population, Grenville's novel can be seen in line of what Canadian literary critics have theorised as historiographic metafiction. This is a subgenre of literary fiction in which texts employ the self-reflective tactics of metafiction while being simultaneously grounded in social and historical reality in order to engage with established narratives of national becoming and to deconstruct national myths. So this text wants us to question what we've always considered to be true and real. It wants us to reconsider what we know as history and to look at beyond the simple you, us and them sort of narrative and realise how from the very beginning they were set up to oppose each other and attack each other, when if we could have been more like Dick, the child born between two worlds, we could have actually had a better future and a better Australia. Okay, guys, I hope you're enjoying reading the novel, and have a look at the mini-series, which is on ClickView, which is free to all students. And the mini-series really brings the series alive and will help you understand the novel and some of the more complex aspects of it. Okay, take care and good luck. Bye.